You see, the biggest and most common mistake that people make with prayer is they pray like pagans and they have a transactional relationship to God. And sadly, lots of true born-again Christians, not just the cultural Christians who grew up in church, people who are actually born again, they also fall back into pagan prayer. Because the bad news is, pagan prayer is the default mode of our sin nature. So for Jesus to teach people to see God as Father was revolutionary. It was likely puzzling to the crowd and aggravating for the religious leaders of that day. Now, this concept of God as Father, it takes center stage when Jesus starts teaching on the Lord's Prayer. But before he teaches on the Lord's Prayer, he first suggests that to pray in secret so that you don't end up praying like hypocrites who love to be seen by others. Because when Christians pray, you got to make your primary audience God. Then he goes on to warn his followers, do not pray like pagans. Now, in modern times, we use the word pagan to refer to someone who lives a wild and godless life. Up at the club, partying it up. But the Greek word used here for pagan here is actually the word that's typically translated Gentiles. And its meaning simply meant those who were godless in terms of the Judaic culture and the Jewish people. People who were unfamiliar with the Judaic scriptures and covenant were called Gentiles. Most Gentiles, most pagans of the ancient world may not have followed the Mosaic law, but the vast majority of them were religious. They practiced all kinds of religious and spiritual practices. Therefore, Jesus here, when he says pagans, he's not talking about irreligious people. He's warning us about pagans who have faith and are very much religious. They are people who pray. They're just praying to different gods. And he says that the way pagans pray is they keep on babbling. The ESV says they heap up empty phrases. Now, I want to point out here the distinction that Jesus is making here, the real dividing line for humanity, is not between the religious and the irreligious. It's between the religious and the Christian. In today's churches, most of the fear is focused on those liberal, progressive, gay activists, the people in Hollywood. They're ruining our society. Lord, send revival and purify our land. And now, in these fears, there are some legitimate concerns, don't get me wrong. But our concerns, are they proportional to the concerns that are on Jesus' heart? Because Jesus did not warn, be sure to pray. Don't be prayerless like the atheists and the tax collectors and the party animal friends you have. Don't be like them and get addicted to drugs and porn and gambling. That's not what he warns here. Jesus' warning addresses a more subtle and difficult to detect trap amongst people who are very much religious, that are very much devoted to prayer. These are people who go out to a Wednesday service or a Friday night prayer or a whatever other prayer meetings there are. 새벽 기도, early dawn prayer. He's talking to them. And Jesus teaches, when you pray, don't babble like the pagans, for they think they're going to be heard for their many words. He says, don't be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask. Now, some people look at verses 7 and 8, and they argue that this means that we shouldn't really ask for things. After all, Jesus says, your Father knows what you need. So they claim that Jesus is saying, God already knows your needs. Don't bother asking. In addition, these folks also usually add, Jesus doesn't want you to be greedy. Remember, you're a wretched sinner who continually sins. You don't deserve anything. So stop knocking on the doors of heaven. Now, it can't be what Jesus means. Because in the Lord's Prayer itself, Jesus teaches us in verse 11 to petition God for our daily bread. I'll unpack what that means a little bit later. So Jesus is not concerned with whether we ask God about our needs. He's concerned about how we ask. Jesus is giving us a mental model of the contrasting basis for going to God in prayer, for how we ask for things, how we engage Him. Now, lots of people who think they are Christians or they're part of a church, but just because they're using the words Our Father doesn't actually mean that they're praying on the basis of Our Father. You see, the biggest and most common mistake that people make with prayer is they pray like pagans and they have a transactional relationship to God. And sadly, lots of true born-again Christians, not just the cultural Christians who grew up in church, people who are actually born again, they also fall back into pagan prayer. Because the bad news is, pagan prayer is the default mode of our sin nature. You see, the contrast between pagan prayer and the Lord's Prayer, it exposes what we believe is the real basis for why our prayer is heard. Going to church, being moral, paying your tithes, going to 새벽 기도, the early morning dawn prayer, these things do not prove that you're really a Christian. Instead, you got to ask yourself, why do I believe that my prayers are being heard? Pagans believe that they are being heard for one reason. Christians believe that they're being heard for a different reason. So what are those two different reasons? Now, in verses 7 through 8, Jesus is talking about two different ways to approach God. Now, when you approach anyone for an interaction, favor, or exchange, you subconsciously assess the basis on which you're approaching that person. The basis determines the level of exchange. So for example, on the streets of Seoul, you can approach a stranger to ask for certain things, especially if you have a non-Korean face. But yeah, even if you have a Korean face, you can still ask for things. One example is you can ask for directions. You get lost. Borrow someone's phone when your battery dies. What's the basis for why a stranger will grant you these requests? Well, they may remember how it felt when they were new to the city. They may empathize. They may remember a time when their battery ran out and they really needed to call their spouse or they call their friend to pick them up. Everyone knows, though, that when you make a request of a stranger, the basis is very limited. You cannot ask, hey, thanks for the directions. Can I hop in your car and can you just take me there right now? We don't know each other. Or, hey, I need to make a few more phone calls. Can I just borrow your phone? And I promise, just give me your address. I'll deliver it back to you tomorrow, right? Everyone knows that this is over the top because you don't have the proper basis to make those types of requests. If you want a bigger exchange, you need a bigger basis. So if you simplify, there are two types of relationships that you can have with others. You can have a business relationship or a family relationship. In a business relationship, the basis is what I have, what I can do for you. In a family relationship, the basis is what I am, who I am to you. In a business relationship, the basis is performance. In family, the basis is commitment. In a business relationship, the basis is very much conditional. In family, the ideal is the basis is unconditional, or it's moving toward being unconditional. Now, in the context of housing, there are two ways in which you can live in someone's house. You can live as a tenant or you can live as family. If you live in someone's house as a tenant, that means that the owner of the house is your landlord. You can build a great relationship with your landlord as long as you fulfill your obligation. You got to pay the rent on time and you got to make sure not to damage their property. And also the landlord has certain obligations to fulfill, whether it's maintenance, paying insurance, and doing the repairs. You can have a good relationship, but the basis of the relationship remains transactional, contractual. There's an exchange of goods and services. And you stay in that relationship only as far as you get something out of it. This is fundamentally a business relationship. But if you live in your parents' home, because you lost your job or you can't find a job, you know that the dynamic is vastly different. The business dynamic is, if you work, you will be accepted. But in the family dynamic, it is, since you are accepted, please get to work. It's vastly different. These are two completely different bases for relationship. So Jesus is showing us here there are fundamentally two bases on which people go to God. Jesus says you can either approach God on a business basis or on a family basis. So how can you tell which basis you're relating to God? Jesus says, look at the pagan. The pagan approaches God on a business basis, and his prayer life is marked with two things: babbling words and many words. Babbling and many. So babbling is a Greek word that simply means empty words, vain words, idle words. And then the second Greek word is just one word. Many words is just one Greek word. And it denotes this oversharing. Oftentimes, what do we feel when we are oversharing? A lot of times we're feeling anxiety. We're anxious that they don't believe what we're saying, or they don't get it, or they don't believe, they're doubtful, or we're doubtful of our position with them. And so we start to overshare, we start to overreach. We get many words. And when these prayers are marked by babbling words and many words, and these prayers don't get answered, the pagan often feels angry or anxious. You feel angry and cold when you feel entitled to what is due. I've been paying the rent. I cannot believe that I'm not getting what I asked for. You feel angry, or you'll be anxious. I haven't really been paying the rent. I've been missing my quiet times quite a lot. And so I'm probably in trouble. A lot of anxiety. You pray diligently, but then things in life, they just don't go well. What's your response? You get angry because you feel like God is not doing his part. When you've been doing your part to stay pure, serve at church, tithing, giving to the poor. Lord, I've been paying the rent. What's going on? Or you feel guilty because you feel like you've been letting God down. In either case, you prove that you are relating transactionally with God, like a tenant or an employee, rather than a family member. So in either case, at a fundamental level, your relationship with God is a business relationship when you pray like a pagan. It's based on your performance and his performance. You got your duties, he's got his. A religious person you see says, God, come into my life and be my landlord. I'll do my part and you do yours. But a Christian is someone who instead says, God, come into my life and be my father. I trust in what Christ has done, therefore, now I do. These are totally two different paradigms. And one way you can tell which basis you're relating to God is you look at your prayer life. Babbling is what happens when communication becomes empty, cold, and impersonal. Have you ever been in a job interview? Either you're the interviewer or the interviewee, and then there's just a lot of babbling going on. It just becomes very cold and impersonal, and you're just like, oh man, just can't wait to get this over with. There's no meaning, there's no warmth, there's no sweetness to your prayer life. Even if your prayers are eloquent and theologically correct and articulate, when you pray in public, you do the 대표기도, you do the corporate prayer, and people are just like, oh. Jin, I was just so blessed by your prayer today. Danelle, so holy. Like you can be as eloquent and articulate when you pray in public, but the real question is, what does your prayer life feel like when you're in private? Is your prayer life cold or impersonal? Do you do it solely out of duty? And are you actually irritated when you feel like God's not coming through? Or is your prayer life marked with anxiety? You feel beaten down by guilt and shame. God, I don't deserve anything anyway. I haven't been a very good Christian. I'm an awful person. I understand why you're not answering my prayers. Now, don't get me wrong. Prayer is a discipline, right? And it's normal to feel prayer feeling a little mechanical or ritualistic sometimes. And as you make it a habit, that's how it can feel. But the normal that Jesus wants you to land on is a prayer life that facilitates the confidence, love, and warmth that you experience when you're a beloved child. So Jesus, when he teaches the Lord's Prayer, how does he begin? Our Creator, who created us from heaven. Our King, who is the ruler of our hearts. Our friend, because I am a friend of God. I am a friend of God. He calls me friend. Now, these things are all true of God, of course. Jesus starts with our Father. Remember, this is a radical teaching to the Jews. They're like, what? We can pray like that? Up until now, this is not what we've known about prayer. How do we even address God as Father? The only Father we addressed was usually Abraham or their rabbi. Say God to be our Father? This is shocking. Now, some of you may personally feel an aversion for the father reference because you had an absent or angry or abusive father. But even if you experience a dysfunctional family, our deep disappointment or resentment, it proves the strength of this paradigm. We all have family relationships in our lives, siblings and parents and children and uncles. And some of these family members, when we consider their behavior and history, if they weren't a member of your family, you probably want nothing to do with it. If you really had it your way, you might, if you met them, as a stranger, you probably wouldn't continue a relationship with them, But why do you continue to interact and have exchanges with them? Why do you help them out when they ask for money or prayer? It's because they are family. You don't get to choose your family. You just simply get to choose how you love your family, how you respond to all of their brokenness and sin. By the way, which also exudes from your own self as a member of that family. So the reason why Jesus insists on making the basis of our prayer life our Father is because these words have profound effects on our relationship with God. He's trying to get across the point that the fatherhood of God and understanding that you are now adopted is the very essence of what it means to be a Christian. Romans 8:15 says, the Spirit you receive does not make you slaves, so that you don't live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you receive brought about your adoption to sonship. And it's by Him we cry. What do we cry? Abba, Father. Abba is just, Aramaic for Appa in Korean. Yeah, Abba, Father, whatever equivalent, modern equivalent you may have in your culture and language. The Holy Spirit enables us to make it feel natural to us to say, Abba, Father. What does it mean to be a Christian? It means we are adopted. It means you are given acceptance, access, and authority. When you receive Christ, you're not adopted, by the way, as an only child. There's no there's no one child policy in heaven right now, right? When you get adopted, you are adopted into the family of God, His church. That means you got to have a relationship also with fellow brothers and sisters. The moment you adopt a child, the essential change that you're looking for is not one of behavior or maturity, but it's one of status. It's a legal change. So what does this mean? It means that the Father legally adopts us and says, you are now part of my family. Whether you behave or misbehave. When you adopt a child, you make a legal promise to treat that child with all the commitment and love that you would to a biological child. Jesus says in John 17:26, He prays to the Father that the love with which you have loved me, the love between Father and Son, may be in them. That's powerful if you really think about it. He's not giving us a lower quality of love. He's not asking the Father, oh, well, you know how they are. So we'll have the biological children and then we'll have the, other children that we tolerate. No. The joy that the Father has for the Son is the same joy He now offers to you. It's really incredible, amazing news if you think about it that way. Especially in light of how sinful we are, how selfish we can be.